All right, good evening. Thanks so much for joining the Research Triangle PowerShell user group. Tonight we have Debbie and Jeremy going to talk to us. And so welcome Jeremy, welcome Debbie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
How's it going? Good,
cool. So tonight we're going to talk about CSS and all that kind of stuff. But let's talk a little bit about you guys. So you give us a little quick thing. So Debbie, talk to us.
Yeah, so I've been working as a web developer for about 5 years now. I got my degree in graphic communications, and all my professors, thought it was really important to learn how to do some front-end stuff, HTML, CSS, basic things like that. So that's how I got my start. And I've basically been working on like WordPress sites and building out the front end for those since then.
Cool. And so then, you had to give Jeremy some tips, and that's how you guys met?
Jeremy and I are neighbors, so we see each other pretty frequently. And then, it came up in conversation one day, and Jeremy's like, hey, you should do a talk for this user group. And I was like, oh, that sounds fun. And I guess the rest is history.
Awesome. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity within PowerShell, like when sending mail messages or just getting data and trying to convert that into HTML, or using that to just bring in and dynamically build something for a better report that I do, and I always end up fighting with CSS. And then also just everything looking forward into the cloud and whatnot. There's so much ability there where having a little bit of basic HTML and CSS knowledge can, take that Azure function to the next level, things like that, by building a better front end for it. And so I was like, I think coming in and talking about this would be really awesome. And she was down to do it. So I suckered her in.
All right.
So Debbie, I wanted to ask you, as a site admin for WordPress, where a lot of people think that WordPress is, you install a theme and you're good to go. But I would assume you still are doing a lot of back-end individual hand coding of stuff to make things appear as you wish.
Yeah. So every WordPress site I've run, we've used custom themes, which usually starts from like a blank slate type of theme, and then you just add everything else that you want. So I do a fair amount of PHP and JavaScript as well.
Oh wow! And when you do the code, do you scream at the code like we do? Because I never know what I'm doing with CSS and HTML.
Of course.
All right. So
screaming or expletive, All right.
All the time.
Well, let's see how much we scream at the code today. So take it away, Debbie.
Okay. So I think Jeremy's going to start by showing how he set up the environment that I'm going to be working in today.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we thought it'd be helpful to kind of just show a little bit about what the environment's going to look like. So we're going to be using a static website inside Azure. So I've created a resource group, and in that resource group, there's only one item, which is the storage account.
Wait, does anybody see
the
that?
Storage account is what's responsible.
Oh, there it goes, finally.
Oh, is my screen not caught up? Okay.
Oh, there we go.
So
your audio is a little squirrely too, so I think just a little hiccup.
Okay, yeah, so like I said, so I have a storage account inside the resource group, and a storage account is responsible for providing access to storage backend inside the cloud. So in this one storage account, we would have table storage, file shares, blob storage, all these different things. And one of the options that exists on any storage account inside Azure is this static website. And it's really simple to turn it on, come in, go to the static website, flip the bit from disabled to enabled, and it'll give you a primary endpoint. So that'll be how you access your website. And then that endpoint is going to look for a root document and a 404 document. So whatever you put in these two values here are going to be the documents that load when somebody just goes to the website, right? So we're going to use an index.html and a 404.html to provide the root document to load the website off of. And if you type something that doesn't exist, then you'll just get that 404.html. And then what we did,
a little.
yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
So what we did is we tied this static website into a GitHub repo so that we have this repo here that has the index and the 404 and then some other stuff. And I added in, so a little primer for, you should definitely come see what Chrissy's going to say. But we've built a little bit of CI/CD into this here. So I have a YAML file that's going to take whatever's in the root of this repo, and anytime a commit is made to this repo, it will push that automatically into the blob storage for that static website. So as Debbie's doing things and making changes, you can see here, it just runs that YAML each time and then publishes that to the static website. And that static website is going to live, if we head to Storage Explorer, whenever you make a static website, Azure automatically creates a unique blob container, and it's $web. So $web is hard-coded as the static website's web root. And so all the files that exist in that repo, I'm loading directly into this $web blob container. We can see all of those showing up right inside of here. And this is how we're going to load and present the web page. So if anybody wants to play along on your own computer, if you take this web address right here, and I'll toss that into chat, if you have that address loaded up in your own browser, you'll be able to refresh as Debbie's making changes and see those show up in your own browser. So that's kind of how the environment's configured for what Debbie's about to show us. So Debbie's going to start editing a bunch of HTML and CSS, and it's all going to load off of this index.html and provide us some useful information.
So Jeremy, let me just jump in for 1 second here. I think you mentioned it, but there was a question. The automation that you're doing behind the scenes is a GitHub action?
It is.
Okay, so
Yeah, so
for
ahead.
the people that are watching at home, the meeting that's going to follow behind this one in our YouTube series will be a deep dive on GitHub Actions with Chrissy Lemaire. So we're not going to be talking too much about the GitHub Actions tonight, but if you want to know more about that, check our catalog for the other stuff. We have a few videos on some automation with GitHub.
Yeah. All right, Debbie.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to start with a really basic HTML here. And I will start with like a little bit of intro into CSS and then get more into some more complicated things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about HTML. HTML and CSS go together, but CSS is the more complicated part. So for now, I just have this basic setup here. And there's a couple ways that you can add CSS styles. For now, I'm going to just include a style tag in the header and put my styles here. But when we move into doing the table, I'll actually use a different file. But I like to be able to see it all in one place. So this is what my web page looks like right now. This is kind of like the default. Everything's going to default to text-align left and this sans serif type font. You can see that there's some spacing here already. So, and I'll kind of show you some of my process too. You can do this in every browser. Like right click and inspect, and you'll see the same things over here. This is really useful, especially just to see like what's going on. If I hover over this, you can see the orange in the screen, that's going to be margin. So as a default, most HTML already has margins associated with them if they are text related. Yeah, so if I want to make this look better, usually I don't want it to be text line and I don't want it to be that close to the top. So I can go in and give the H1 a couple properties. The first is going to be text align center, and then some top padding. Actually, yeah. So when I do that, I'm not going to push this yet. I'm just going to show you on my this is running from my computer. So it moves to the center, and I don't want to have to do that for every single element on the page. I don't want to have to go in and say H1P, any other H tags I have. So instead, I can assign a class, which I have to this div, and the H1 and the P are inside of the div. So if I say the text align here is centered, then everything inside of this container is going to be text align center as well. And I no longer need to have that on the H1. So that's pretty much the basics of CSS right there. It gets a lot more complicated after that. I think what most people struggle with is remembering these CSS properties. And I'll give you guys a tip. A lot of times if you go into your browser and you start typing padding, it'll come up already. And then you can kind of add things in there and you can see how that changes it. So you can see that the padding is green here.
So in this fashion, you can change those values on this live website, or is this just you're within your local instance or the local play?
This is local. So I'm kind of starting local here because a lot of the times when you're testing things out, you're going to do it locally.
So what I'm saying is we can change that stuff on the right, but it doesn't really affect the web page itself.
Oh,
you refresh,
that's right.
It's going to all go back to normal.
That's right. Yeah. So if you change anything in here, it'll go back to the way it was before, which is a really nice tool if you're just kind of messing around with things. And there's different things you can find, like CodePen, that will do things like that too. So you don't have to keep refreshing and going back and forth between your files and all of that.
Debbie, can I
Yes.
jump in a second on that?
Yeah.
So just from a security standpoint, this is why you don't necessarily want to do client-side security or do that kind of stuff at the client, because someone can just F12 into the dev tools and strip out whatever security that you have in place or modify it. And then the browser will then do whatever you told it to do. I've seen an instance where someone put a CAPTCHA in a client-side tag, and the bad guys took the CAPTCHA out, and then they could just spam the server.
Good tip.
Yeah, that's a good tip. Okay.
So, Debbie, I just wanted to, before you go too far, are you able to see the chat? Do you need us to bring any questions up to you?
Oh, I'm not looking at the chat right now.
Okay, so you don't have to. We'd be happy to do that, but I just wanted to let you know. So there was a question about are classes threaded? And I think that was meant when you're doing the style and you were setting the class there. Could you make like a subclass? I guess that's what you were asking, Stephen.
No, I wanted to know whether the classes were in session.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's not a question.
There's not really a question there. That was for Mike DeGronat.
That's
So
Stephen is no.
the idea is some of those classes are you know, is there a thing with classes versus divs and you know, like some of that process? Is there a design methodology there? Why you
For
use?
me, oh, classes versus divs. Yeah. So a lot of times you'll end up with like a lot of divs. In terms of layout, when it comes to CSS, you want to lay out the HTML kind of how the design is laid out. So you'll have a lot of divs on a page, and if you set styles for every single div, you're going to have a ton of padding on your page, and you don't always want that. So a lot of times I don't create any styles for a div because every single div is going to have that style, and that can be like a lot to control. Usually it's kind of unnecessary. And actually, when I start CSS, I will set all the default padding and margins to 0, just so I'll have complete control over how that looks. But that's more of a design thing. Okay. Were there any other questions?
No, still good tip.
Okay.
Diego had a question about using ID. Diego, can you expand on what your question is?
Well, we'll come back to it.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll just say the reason I don't use ID is because I'll use it for different things. So if I'm doing a href to a different section on the page, I'll use ID for that. Or if I'm creating, in general, there will be a little JavaScript associated with that. So I don't want to have like a bunch of IDs on a page.
So I think what he was saying there is that he was asking about when you were making the original H1 and the original style section. So it sounds to me like you're saying IDs have a place, and what you were doing in the beginning is not the best use of an ID.
You can use ID. There's no issue with that. I just don't. I just use class most of the time because
Gotcha.
I do use IDs for different things.
Okay.
You really ID and class is interchangeable when it comes to CSS. So unless there's like a JavaScript reason not to use ID, either way it works.
Okay, so Diego clarified. He wanted to know why you used class equals container and not ID equals container.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's what you were saying before. Okay.
Right. And yeah, container is very common to see in Bootstrap as well. I saw somebody ask that question. Okay. So just kind of going over some basics of CSS here. CSS does stand for cascading style sheet. So as you go down in the style sheet, the things that come later are going to be more important. And specificity is really important in CSS. If you have, say I had container H, wow, I spelled that wrong. Container H1, and I change the color to like a dark gray. Color is font color. So that's going to be the font color. So if I set the color to white, it'll be white, you won't see it. But if this class exists lower on the page and it's more specific, it's going to overwrite the previous class. So sometimes there'll be issues with that. Like if you're having issues with your style sheet, sometimes it's because something is more specific or it's lower in the style sheet.
So that line 6 is read as within the container class and H1, you know, value, right? That's how that line's read? That's
correct. So if I had another H1, which is an SEO no, you should only have one H1. But if I did have another one, the one outside of the container class would be there, but it would be white, and it's not center aligned because it's not inside the container. Okay. So those are kind of the
SEO tips to keep them coming.
Yeah. Those are just some basics to get us started. And then I think something we really want to talk about was kind of how we can make tables prettier. So I've got a table here. It's currently, this is an inline style and it's set to display none. So it's not appearing. But if I delete that, then it'll revert to the default, which is display block. And you'll see that now on the page. So there's a few things really easy that you can do to make a table look nicer. Mostly borders, text align, padding are going to be really helpful. So the border property you can actually add on the table, but I'm not going to do that because I'm doing CSS. I'm actually going to add it here and then go back and add my CSS file into the head. So I do have to Google this a lot because it's hard for me to remember if it's source or what you use to link a style sheet. I think it's rel equals style sheet and then source for the CSS document. And because it's in the same folder, I can just link it like that. Sometimes you'll have to add like the full URL, but I usually use relative links. And I can see that it is linked there. And I'm going to go ahead and push my changes. So those of you who open that link on the other page can see them as well.
So part of that, you had that table hidden initially. So that table was always there, right?
That table was always there.
It was
I did have it hidden and I had the tags closed.
So, so Debbie, let me ask, because I'm definitely a CSS noob here.
Okay.
So the idea of what you're doing here, I completely get it. But from a high level
Great.
view, we're basically saying my index HTML is going to be basically, for lack of a better term, my data file, or where I'm going to put all my data elements, and the style is going to be all this formatting stuff. So instead of putting anything in the index the HTML, I'm going to say reference this style sheet, and the style sheet is going to be the guideline that the page is going to follow to format things.
Yeah. So after you write a CSS file, you can basically use it on whichever page you want.
Okay.
If you just add it in the head here, you're going to have to like copy paste that and put that on every page you have. But if you link it like this, you can just add this link here, and then you only have to edit your CSS in one place.
Being an infrastructure person, I like to think of CSS as configuration management for web pages.
And I guess the jumping ahead, that allows you to reuse style sheets or CSS files for multiple pages because now it's separate outside.
Yes.
Okay.
So part of that also is that single style sheet can be for multiple pages kind of stuff too, or you need to then play with containers and classes and all that kind of stuff to keep them separate? Or what does that structure look like typically?
I'll reuse classes a lot. So if I'm making a template for like WordPress, my header of the page is always going to look the same, or like my banner with the title. So usually the HTML will look the same on all of those pages.
But I was thinking more like your style sheet would have all of the formats for all the different types of tables that you're going to use, and then you'd only use them in certain pages where you need them, right? Or you break them into different style sheets?
It just depends. If your style sheet is massive, then you should probably break them up. But if it's small, then it's fine to just use one.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So, got the table. Yeah, that's there. And my text is back because I moved those And I'm not sure that the CSS is updated yet. Okay, sorry. Let me not confuse you. Let's move on to the table. So I can add some, I'm gonna add the border to the table. And the border element takes 3 arguments: border width, border type, and border color. Yeah, so VS Code actually has it come up with the syntax right there, which is really nice. So there's plenty of, tools to help you if you can't remember any of these things, which, when I first started, I was looking. Actually, it looks like I didn't.
So in that same kind of vein, you said, VS Code is kind of your helper there. So
Yeah.
it's like we acknowledge VS Code is kind of our friend with PowerShell. Is there any special extensions you look at, or it's pretty much in box?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
So like you said, that kind of tab help, and is there any special extensions that you use, or that stuff is just it's in VS Code directly?
Yeah, that's in VH Code and most text editors, and it is href instead of src. Whoever said that in the chat, yeah. So now you can see my styles. So I gave the table a border, and it's created a box around the entire thing. So I'm going to go through here and inspect element. And it looks like it's actually the table TD element I want to put a border on. So I'll try that in here. And it does 1. That's great. So when I go back into my CSS, I'll create the TD element and put my border in there.
So I'm getting the impression that you're very hands-on, which is probably the same way that most of us work, which is we may know how this stuff works, but you're actually doing it and making sure it works exactly as you want. And then when it works the way you want, you commit it to the code that so that that it's going to do it. It's going to act in a way that you expect.
That's right.
Okay.
So,
and I was just going to say for reference, for the noobs like myself, you're formatting the table, but the style sheet basically says format any table on the page according to these specs. We just happen to have one table right now.
That's right.
Okay.
So I can actually add another table and it will look exactly the same because I've added these style properties to this table HTML element. So if I gave the table a class and then I gave the class these changes, then only tables with the class would have those, if that makes sense. Okay. So this is how our table looks. I'm going to add a couple more elements, changes. It looks like there's a P tag inside of all of these. I'm going to add some padding. Just start with 20 pixels. And then another cool thing you can do is a pseudo element. So I could say nth child and put odd there and change the background color to be a mid-gray. So if I do that, this will have every other row have that mid-gray background color. And I'll push that. So you can see the few changes I've made have drastically changed how this looks, kind of. Now we have every other row with a background color, so it's a little easier to read and more spacing. That looks like it's probably a little bit too much spacing, so that's something you can kind of play with the padding. can do padding top. Let's do 5. Padding bottom 5. And left will do 10. So that is like a lot of different properties. There's also a way to do shorthand with padding. And so instead of writing like different padding for every single one, it goes clockwise. So if I want to do top 5, start with that. The right hand, I'll do 20.
So can I ask a quick question about that end thing? That kind of like blew my mind.
Oh,
Can you say like every 3 or just the first, or like is it only just odd and even? And
it does take integer values. So I could do 3 and let's see if that's the correct syntax. Yeah, and then I'll do every third. And I will say that those pseudo elements, which is like any element that comes after a colon, those aren't generally supported in emails. If you're on a website or a web page, those have really good compatibility, but emails, it's like hit or miss.
oh, so
Yeah.
everything we've done here, you can basically put that inside of an email and ship that as an email, and it would look just like this. Most of
Most of
everything
it.
done so far.
Yeah, just be careful with pseudo elements. Not every email supports that. Same with like hovers.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so Debbie, so I want to ask you a question before you get too
Okay.
far ahead. I
Yeah.
saw when you were doing the original config and you picked an element inside the table and it said it was TD and then there was P. I know you're familiar with those terms, but what do those represent? So, I mean,
Right.
I know they're elements of the table, but like I'm trying to figure out in my head, what does TD and P actually mean, or are they shorthand for a bigger word? Like I'm just trying to
Good
understand what the
question.
meaning of P is.
P is for paragraph. Those are HTML tags. So you can, I think, do literally whatever you want for a tag, but don't quote me on that. There's a lot of different like widely accepted tags, like P is for paragraph, H1, H2, all the way to H6 are header elements. So that's like header 1, header 2.
Okay, so I'm familiar with the headers and that kind of stuff.
Right.
I just wasn't familiar with table divider and paragraphs, so that's why my tables always look crappy.
And then TR.
Yeah, so like if you go Debbie, can you go back to the index.html?
Yeah.
So right here, Michael, if you look, like you can see TD, P, TR. So in HTML, it's building the table here by saying there's a table and then there's a table row. And in that table row, there's table data. And in that table, in that one column, there's the P for the paragraph. And then it closes the data, closes the row, and moves on to the, like, so she's using these tags to define what the CSS is applied to.
Okay, so thank you. I understand that. So this is a non-Debbie question because she's not super VS Code aware. Does anybody know if like any of this HTML is a snippet available to build that like on the fly rather than having to, because that, that's a lot of code to write. Anybody aware of a snippet in VS Code to make that table and then you fill in the data later?
There is, but I don't know what it's called. I'll look it up.
Okay, so it's a possibility.
Yes, it's possible.
Okay.
I think of it, Mike. Think of the TD as being the cell with the cell on a particular row. So TR being a row and TD being the cell on that row, if that's helpful.
Hey, Debbie.
Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna change that back to odd. Okay. Does that make sense with the padding?
Makes sense and looks cool.
Okay. So yeah. Top, right, bottom, left. It goes clockwise. Okay. So that is more readable. I'm not crazy about this space in between here. And I think if we set the table border collapse, nope, might go away. No, that's not correct. I spelled collapse wrong. Okay, there we go. All right, that's what I was looking for. We got there. So if we set border collapse to collapse, we won't have those like overlapping borders like that. Come on. Okay, thank you, VS Code. Yeah, so, and I have a CSS file set up that has these table styles in it. So another pseudo element we can use in non-emails would be the hover element. So if we want to be able to hover over part of the table and have the row highlighted, we can do the pseudo element hover and then add a different background color to that. And then when you go and hover over, the whole row will change color, which is really nice if you have a lot of rows to look over. Oh. So I'll just push that through. Are there any questions about that?
We had a question here
Okay.
from Dave. Said he wants to know, so he's asking as a question, so behaviors can be pseudo elements.
Yes.
I'm glad you know what that meant, because
I don't know what that means. So say that. What does that mean?
Oh, sorry. So a hover is like a behavior.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And that's
We
why.
can look up what other behaviors there are. Examples of.
Yeah. I couldn't give you many more examples. I only use hover for the most part.
Well,
And
that's
then,
enough.
yeah.
It only matters the ones that are useful.
Right. Yeah. I do look up a lot of things, and there's a lot of good resources for a lot of this stuff. The hard part is pretty much just knowing what to Google.
Okay, so thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. So I think if the table stuff makes sense, we can talk about some more complex CSS things like Flexbox, which is the best thing since sliced bread for me in CSS. And Flexbox is a way to format divs on a page rather than a table, because tables are not very flexible. So if you have a responsive website, you don't want to be using tables. And that's just a display property. It's going to be display flex. And I'm going to give some width and height to those divs I put inside there, just so that we can actually see them. We'll see how that looks. All right, they have become one. but they are side by side. So that's one of the main differences. So if we do anything in Flex, it's going to be a side by side thing. Divs are displayed block, so they will generally be on top of each other. So if I take away the Flex, it's going to go vertical rather than horizontal. So the nice thing about Flex is if I set the width to 25%, it's always going to be 25%. Even if there's stuff inside of it, they'll force it to be 25%. But if I set a minimum width to 250 pixels, let me add a border so you can actually see. Actually, let me add padding. I changed my mind. Sorry. Margin. Okay, so we can see our blue boxes, and they're always 25%, but okay, needed to add the flex wrap property. But with a minimum width of 250, they'll never be less than that. So if we change the screen width, they'll stack on top of each other rather than just staying next to each other. So this is really nice for responsiveness. Okay. So those are just some like CSS basics. Were there any more questions about that?
So you had mentioned earlier when we were talking about the nth child, and we talked about integers, you give the reference of the thirds, and you had gone on to say that that's not really supported outside of like web, like for email, stuff like that. I would assume some of this Flex stuff probably isn't well supported inside of email or anything like that as
No.
well, right? Okay.
You won't be using that inside of email. That would be a web thing. There's not a lot you can do inside of an email, and most of the time you're going to have to do inline styles for emails. So,
which is the other question I was going to ask, like how do you use a style sheet with the email? And I kind of thought that that wasn't going to be able to be done either. So it makes sense.
yeah, emails are pretty annoying for everybody.
They are. It's a easy
you
way
just-
to go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, couldn't you just like inject the CSS in the top of the email, like in the HTML raw? It's not in a style sheet, but you could just inject it, right?
Yeah, you'd have a style tag at the top, you mean, and then do inline CSS.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not pretty or it's not easily manageable, but you just throw it in there, right?
Yeah, but I mean, for an email, it only applies to the one email anyway, so that would make sense.
So I have a question, and this may not be Debbie's strong point. I'll ask maybe someone on the call knows. Does anybody know how well Teams supports this kind of stuff? Because a lot of people send alerts and tables and data to Teams now instead of emails and something like that. All right.
There you go. You got homework, Mike.
Yeah, that's actually a really good thought. I don't know. I've never thought about that.
All right, let's go. I'm excited. This is getting good.
Yeah.
Oh,
So Dave wanted to know about EM units.
oh, okay. So
Can
EM
I know that
units. Oh, do you want to take that question?
No, I was just it's M dash. You pronounce it M dash. All right, I'll shut up. Never mind.
Yeah, don't listen to him. He doesn't know anything anyway.
So EM units are based off of the default font size for the P tag. So the default size is 1 EM, but it's usually actually like 14 pixels. So it's really easy to control this if you set your P to 10 pixels. Oh, sorry, I have to do the actual property here. So if I set font size to 10 pixels, then 1 EM would be 10 pixels. And I forget, there's a difference between EMs and REMs. REM is relative EM. So if you have different font size set, it depends on like which is relative to the other. Position in CSS is a difficult topic to tackle because position, there's absolute, relative, fixed, I think, and maybe static are the 4. I think there may be 4 or 5. But if you set it to 10 and you set EM, I'm going to save this and refresh. So I just set the font size to 10. So this should be 10 pixels now. And then this is based off of that. So if I set H1 to 3 EMs, it should be roughly 30 pixels, pixel height. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. Just like when EMs first started coming out, it was difficult to, the application of it seems easy conceptually, but the implementation of it seems quite difficult because now you're basing everything relative off the size of another thing. Do
Right.
you use EMs more, or do you find you just stay with, point and font size in pixels?
I usually use pixels. If I do use EMs, I will use the relative REM. I found that more consistent relative EMs.
Yeah, just when you're looking at a site between like a desktop and a mobile device or something, or you're changing the window size of it, like the EM seems to be where it'll just squeeze it down, and it's unreadable.
Oh, I think what people do is they'll have a they'll use a media boundary. So in responsive CSS, we use what's called a media tag. Let's see, looks like it's coming up with it already. And you can set a window. The syntax on this is, I have a hard time remembering it. Window max width of 1000 pixels or min width. So what that does is if you write styles inside of here, those styles will only be applied at that window. So what some people will do is they'll change their font size based on window width. So when you hit a certain window width, the font size will change. And if you use EMs, then everything will change to a smaller size. Not sure that worked. I do end up doing a lot of back and forth and testing things when I write things. Maybe it's min width. I probably wrote the media query wrong. Almost always have to Google this.
It's it's one of the things that I struggled with when the EMs first came out, and I couldn't really wrap my head around when would be the best time to use that. It just seemed better to stay with pixels and point size.
Yeah, it's generally better just to keep your text the same size. Usually that would be used for if you have a hero section that has really large text. So when you go down to a mobile screen, you need to make the text smaller. And sometimes people they call them breakpoints when you change the CSS for different screen widths. So they'll set multiple breakpoints and then change that like base size at each breakpoint.
And it's not just the font size. You can move elements. You can move elements around and hide elements or show elements based upon your available real estate at, you know, screen laptop size or tablet size or smartphone size. So you've got a lot of power based upon your available real estate.
You really do. I use the media query all the time when I'm doing responsive website, and you don't have to rewrite anything. Whatever you write here, because of the nature of the cascading style sheet, it will overwrite whatever is above it. So you should always put your media tags at the end of your style sheet, and you don't have to repeat anything in them. You will just overwrite whatever you wrote before. Yeah, and you can literally do whatever you want there. That's what I like about CSS. I feel like you can literally do anything.
Okay, so when you use a media tag later on and you do not specify a property within that, does it remove that property from the application of the property from the previous media tag?
No.
Okay.
So let me give an example.
It'll only overwrite the specific tag that the specific property that you're calling out.
That's correct.
Okay.
So the only thing that will be overwritten is properties that you specify or you change.
Think of it as a last one in wins rather than overwrite.
Yeah.
Yep. Got it.
Okay. So I really wanted to try to answer a lot of the questions you guys might have. It's kind of hard to do a full CSS lesson in a small amount of time. So I try to cater it to what you guys need. I'd like to take any questions anyone might have right now, if there are any.
Well, I think you've done pretty good. You've done a great job so far, and especially
Okay.
'cause, that table looks awfully familiar to me. So I like the focus. I like that. I'm gonna use that in some other code I have. And then the end thing is that I've gotten a lot of tips out of this. This is great.
Yeah.
Hey, Debbie, Josh said he missed a little bit, wants to know if you can start from the beginning.
Oh gosh.
Adil asked, how long did it take you to get this good? Please give us hope.
Not too long. I think 6 months on the job. Well, it was pretty quick. I started to explore CSS animations in like my first year of working. So I think not too long. Have hope. It's okay. The hardest part is just remembering all the properties. But if you do use like writing some code inside the developer console is really helpful for me. So that's my tip, is just do whatever you want in here. And then, mess it up all you want. Exact center of the screen. I'm reading the comments now. Does that mean vertically and horizontally? Okay. So I would use Flexbox to do that. And I can go through that. I'll have to delete everything. Let me just actually I'll just do it in here. Give you a quick example, and then I can put something up on the server later. So using Flexbox, yeah, so I set it to flex, set the height to 100 viewpoint height, and the width to 100%. Oops, I did dollar sign 100%. And so if I hover over this, I can see that there it is, the whole width of the page and the height. And then justify content center and align items center. And then it'll always be in the exact center. And then you can actually like duplicate this, not inside of it. Sorry. Okay. And then as you scroll, they'll be the same distance apart and still in the center of the screen if you stack them like that. So Flexbox is basically the best thing ever. I think they have a new CSS property called Grid, but it doesn't have the same compatibility across all the browsers that Flexbox does. There's a website you can look at called Can I Use for CSS properties, and it will show you the whole range of compatibility. So Grid has pretty decent compatibility now. Obviously, Opera Mini never supports anything, but pretty good in Chrome, Firefox, Safari. And I think people do use Edge. And this will actually show you the usage of the browser too. So I really like this tool. Like, you don't have to worry about IE because only 0.12% of people use it. So that's a good tool. I can probably link that. Oh, I did want to show you guys. This is something I put together. This is all CSS. It's on my code pen. I did not use any JavaScript to create this. Those little people are made out of CSS. I mean HTML, and then the animations are CSS. There's a, yeah, I wasn't, the timing's kind of weird, but since I flipped over to this tab on accident, the transform property is, yeah, CSS transformations are awesome. So if you guys have any questions, I'm here. I don't know. Yeah. Where am I? Okay. Yeah. So I'll add that.
Some other stuff, and knowing that you kind of talked about Flex stuff like that, but the idea that I know that there's some black magic with mobile devices, and so that kind of fun stuff, like, hey, this table looks crappy because it's on a mobile device, but if it's not on a phone, it's different. Are there any like tips and tricks there?
For tables, your flexibility is not very good, unfortunately. So if you're stuck using tables, it's just not going to be great. You are going to have side scroll.
Okay.
You can do a browser detection for that though, right? And then apply a style based on the detected browser.
Oh, I'm not sure. I think that may be in the media query, a media query you can use in CSS.
Well,
I don't know if there's a new trick these days, but it used to be when you had Firefox and older like Chrome coming out, and then different, like 8 different browser types, you had to kind of detect what was going to work on what browser. So the best way to do that was just to query, what are you using, and then try and do that.
Did we lose Debbie's audio?
Oh, hello.
Okay.
No.
The screen was moving, but I wasn't hearing anything.
Oh, sorry.
Debbie, there were a bunch of people asking if they can have that CSS dancer thing so they can see what you wrote and how that works. Is it possible to get that into the repo?
Oh, yeah. Oh, the repo?
Yeah. And then
Yeah.
just so everybody knows, all this that she's doing, we're going to take this and throw it in the RTPSUG repo. So in a few days, this will be in our repo because the website that you're currently going to is going to get thrown away. I don't want to pay for this in perpetuity.
So some of the takeaways here, so I think like Phil and myself were thinking email focused, right? So I feel like there's sort of a format that we can kind of pick here. Obviously the flex table is not going to do it, or the nth thing, the nth child with the thirds or anything like that. I totally understand that, but I can develop a style that I like for my tables and for my HTML for the body of an email, and then I can just sort of save that as a template and just throw that in as inline style, and then I'm kind of good to go. So I never really thought of it that way. That's a good takeaway for me.
So yeah, in that same thing with Mike, I got to go back and look at some of the code that I've written before. But this whole stuff here, I can just copy that and put it inside this. Like Jeremy, right? That I can just do that with the, output or convert to HTML and put that in the style. Is that how we do it?
Yeah. So actually, one of the things that we were gonna, I was gonna show when she was done with this stuff. Debbie, do you mind if I share real quick?
Oh, no. Where? Okay.
But I could just take all that line 1 through 19 there, and then just dump that into the top of a header block, and the block of a some code like a here string, and then it just becomes my email. You gotta make
so
that
like I can do.
Yeah, you gotta make that bigger.
Hold on, I'm working on it.
Okay.
So I can do like get process, select object, first 5, right? And so we would get that list of processes, and then take that and pipe that to convert to HTML. And then convert to HTML has a bunch of things on it, right? So that we can pass through. So like title, whoa, what's going on with my computer? My keyboard just went crazy. I can't, hold on. For real, I just lost my ability to type. There we go. No, I still can't.
Can you kill the meeting?
Top 5. Not really the top 5, but y'all know how to get the top 5 process if you wanted to, right? And then the important part of this is that, which Debbie would have put that where? To paste. Do you remember what that was? It just style sheet? Is that the same one that I was using for the table earlier, Debbie? Is that what's up there?
Let me send it to you again.
Was that tagged CSS URI?
Yeah, hold on. Let me find this URI. I don't want to share my personal email out to everybody.
So wait, you can send when you do. I didn't know that you can do convert to HTML and point it at a URI.
It's table.css. Here we go. Copy link. All right, so let me reshare again.
I may have moved that file.
Oh, well, let's see what happens.
Put it in it's in the examples folder.
Okay. So just add examples here.
Yeah.
So the cool thing about convert to HTML is, yeah, you can pass it a URI to a style sheet. And so Debbie went ahead and created one for tables. And so convert to HTML will take whatever you pass into it and just build a table right off of it, right off the bat. Right. And then there's some other things that we can do, like pre-content. We'll put stuff at the front of it. So list of processes, and post content will drop whatever you put in here at the bottom of the table. So someone help me, right? And then it'll dump all of that out right here for us. And so what we can do is we can take that and we'll just outfile that directly to my desktop, which is in OneDrive. .htm, and then this will automatically make a web page with all of those styles that she had in that sheet right off the bat. And so you can see at the top 5 processes is already in the title. Whatever you want before the table goes here. Whatever you want after the table goes here. So PowerShell with a tiny little style sheet, and everybody is probably pretty comfy with just getting some information. So whatever you get, you can build your own objects, do whatever you need to. And what you would always do to make a report, right? And then now we just want to be able to put that report in an HTML file to send away to somebody else so that they can go read that data. You can turn that into something very consumable to any other end user after you do your normal processing by just sending it to convert HTML and then using a publicly available URI. So again, Azure's super cheap. Go make you a storage account and just throw your style sheet in there and then leave it be. It'll cost you less than a penny to keep that there all month. And then you can just point at it every time you want to point at it, and then have every table you make look the exact same, which is pretty slick, right? So to go to your point, it doesn't necessarily have to be built in line. You can do it outside and then let the HTML still have that load in for you and work. Only in emails are you stuck with inline only.
Well, wait, so what really said there is when I created the HTML that I'm going to send as an email, I can send all that, but I can point it at a CSS file that's on the network somewhere. And be it, you pointed it at an H record, a HTTPS site, but I can point it to a UNC path. It just did it just as easily, right? Because it's going to generate some HTML for me, and then I'm going to use that HTML to put it inside the body of the message.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I've never tried to point I've never tried to use a UNC path as a location.
Well, I just don't want to like be pointing at some public, entity, I'm going to do all this stuff internally. I don't want to, I have an internal stuff where even I can push it to an internal website, but why am I hosting an internal website just for a CSS page?
Right. I mean, you could, if you have an internal Git, just send it to your Git repo and then call it straight out of your Git repo. Man.
Yeah.
Yeah, but not everybody has that. Like you want it to be like just a simple file that you might stick on a share, and then where all your reports get dumped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that way, when you're opening it up, or if you're sending it out, because I've done a lot of reports where they're auto-generated reports and the email gets sent out. You want to be able to have that central location to pull it from, but it's not necessarily an internet-based one. So that way, when you open up the report, that's less content within the report itself, but it's pulling in the style. It's going to make that data available, because sometimes you want to take and suck that data back in to PowerShell to kind of parse it down and do something else with it later on. So that's kind of handy to do, be able to have that style sheet in there for the human readable part, but then leave the data as plain as possible for automating it later on.
Yeah. That's super cool. I learned a lot. Cool. Any other questions?
So Debbie, where are some places where we can, like, do you know any places to learn CSS? Like with, I know for us, like writing PowerShell and stuff, we can do Iron Scripter, or there's some stuff in Code Wars and things like that. Are there utilities or websites that are out there that have some good examples for, like, for me, I'm pretty kinesthetic to learn by doing, or what would you just suggest people to look at if they're to get better and sharpen their CSS skills?
Yeah, so I use CodePen a lot. That's what I had my CSS animation example in. And if you go there, there's a lot of different examples of people's work. You can like fork, you can take it and then you can change it and edit it how you want to by like copying it. So I've done that a lot. There's a lot of different resources. I like CSS Tricks is a website. There's a guy who writes a lot of different like posts about, like he's got a really good Flexbox post. So those are probably my top 2 picks. And I'm also like a learn by doing kind of person. So those are more resources for people who do learn by doing. Yeah. And if you Google it, there's a lot of different things out there, like Code Academy. There's some free ones you can do if you want. But pretty much anywhere you can do like a coding class, they'll have CSS.
So I really like the idea of building a couple of templates and just referencing the template, because honestly, for what I do, it's repetitive kind of action, right? So I don't think I need to be customizing this each time. I kind of have sort of like, well, that's kind of what I want it to look like. I wish I could just call that. So the example that Jeremy showed off is like super useful.
Right.
Yeah,
And
that's kind of the golden for me, is that I want to start generating these emails, and I've just been copying generic, code and just sticking it right inside the script as raw. But if I can simply keep that as a reference file and just point at it, and then even if I can change the style sheet at some other time, I can just change that one file and all my reports change. So it's good. Good. You were saying, Debbie.
right, for sure. I mean, a lot of people just steal CSS. That's pretty common. Like, if you find something on CodePen that you like, you can pretty much just take it and use it in a different context. Just change a couple things, stuff like that.
Cool.
All right, so I think we're going to be wrapping this up in a few minutes. So there was quite a bunch of questions about individual pieces to CSS and HTML tricks. Does anybody have any further questions they wanted to talk about, ask, or go over something that they saw earlier that maybe didn't make sense? We have an opportunity here to possibly review 1 or 2 things. So last chance. Remember, if you want to ask the question, just unmute yourself. If you want to throw it in the chat, please do so now if you have any final questions. All right, so Charles wants to say, I'm still struggling to understand about position, relative, and absolute in CSS. So, Debbie, would you mind running through that a little bit again?
Sure. It's hard to give an example, but it depends on ancestry and parent divs. So if you set a div to absolute, it is only going to be absolute to the closest relative parent, if that makes sense. I can give an example. Okay. So I'm going to actually just go to a website that I work on. My company's website. Hope that's okay. Stop me if you guys have a problem with that.
No, feel free.
Okay. So I created this menu, and these are div elements. The dropdown is an element, so it might actually be a unordered list or UL element, but they work the same as any other element. Yeah. So this is actually positioned absolute, and its closest relative parent is going to be the UL element that it lives inside of. So the blue area is that item, that element. And this is positioned absolutely to that element, if that makes sense. So right now this has a 0 opacity. If I set this, sorry. Okay, there it is. So if I removed the relative position from that element, it would no longer be relative to that. It's going to be relative to something higher up in the DOM tree that has position relative, which is probably going to be this item right here. Does that make sense?
I understand that.
Okay. So it just depends on the parent. If something is fixed, it doesn't matter what the parent is. It is always going to be fixed to the window.
So if the window becomes more narrow, what happens since it's an absolute?
It depends on what the parent div does. This isn't a really good example because my menu changes at this point. Okay, but because of, yeah, this is probably not going to be a really good example of this. So if it'll basically just follow whatever the parent does.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're basically saying there's a rule set it's going to follow, right?
That's right.
So depending on the rules that are in place, it's going to default back to something previous, depending on hierarchy, it sounds like.
Exactly. So if this section, these are two different sections with the different backgrounds. If it's positioned absolute in this section and this section gets really small, the height will change. So these images are changing the height of this to be taller. It's still going to be positioned inside of this div. So if I had set it to top 0, left 0, it would be up here, and it will always just be in the top corner. If you set it to top 50%, it's going to be in the middle. It will start in the middle of this. And when the parent div changes, it'll still be like in the middle. So it's a hierarchy thing.
Stephen, you had a question?
Yeah, I actually have two questions. One is how much of the work that you wind up doing for clients or customers is trying to resolve tickets where someone says it looks bad? That's question one. And question two is how many browsers do you actually test when you're designing a website in CSS?
So I will test the main browsers. So Safari, Firefox, and Chrome, and I'll usually test those on mobile and at the desktop size. I guess most of my requests are based on how things look. But it's there's a lot of different reasons why things look weird, so it's kind of hard to.
But so to take the inverse of that, it sounds like, Debbie, you're saying, like, I have my standards, and I know that if it looks good in these 3 or 4 browsers, in mobile and desktop, I'm fine with that. And if someone has a display issue and it's not within these,
Right.
it may not be preferred, but we're going to either stick them to preferred browsers or say, I'm kind of okay because you're sort of out of the scope of what we designed for.
Right. Yeah. So
In other words,
you
can't support everything.
Right. You can't support everything. You try to put in fallbacks. Like sometimes people don't use JavaScript. But if you're working in CSS, that's usually not a problem. So
Has life, I was just going to say, has life become easier for you as a web designer now that more browsers are Chromium based, so they're all sort of using the same engine?
Absolutely, yes. I will say it's less of an issue nowadays. Back when I first started, all the time, it was like, this doesn't work on Internet Explorer. And so that's part of the reason I mentioned that can I use chart. There's a thing called browser prefixes, which you'll have to use with certain CSS properties. And I'll share my screen again. That just looks like adding like a prefix before the styles. So shoot, let me just actually come up here. So for Flex, you used to have to write display MS Flex and then display like O. No, it was WebKit. So I forget what WebKit. Yeah. So fortunately, a lot of editors will kind of have that in there. They'll kind of remember for you. But sometimes, like back in the day, I would have display written like 4 or 5 times with different browser prefixes in front of it, just so that it would work for every browser.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot simpler now. There's a lot more compatibility with Flexbox.
Steven, did you have follow-up stuff? You still hit the hand up. I just want to make sure.
All right, cool. I took my hand down. I'm good.
So what I was somewhat curious. Have they done this? Have they done the display except, which is it'll be everything but this particular browser? Or is it a white list only, or can there be a black list?
I think that you would use like a media query for that. So I haven't had to do that, but I'm actually going to Google that. Media query. I'm not sure. I think I have to get back to you on that one.
It's no big deal. It was a matter of curiosity.
Yeah, I think they have media queries for that. Sometimes in the JavaScript too. Sometimes people used to use different style sheets for different browsers.
So a big takeaway for me tonight is I never thought of making a template and investing time in a template, and whatever the upfront time to make that template seems much more worth it now because it becomes reusable. And then I know we saved it till the very end, but Jeremy's example of how to basically pass in this template, which Debbie showed us how to build and do all these wonderful things in, and then take that template and pass it in on the fly with PowerShell, do the magic that PowerShell does, was like super eye-opening. I love that tonight. That was such a great takeaway. Debbie, I think you did a fantastic job. I want to say thank you so much. I really enjoyed this tonight.
Thanks for having me. I always like talking about CSS.
So
If
maybe
I- Sorry, go on.
no, go ahead. I stepped on your toes there. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say if I sound monotone, that's just how I talk when I'm talking about code.
No, I think you did honestly, I think you did a fantastic job. Understand that with the exception of probably 3 or 4 of us, most of us are not HTML, CSS junkies. And as you could tell from some of my questions early on, I mean, you kind of brought us through in a very orderly fashion that was easy to figure out. And so kudos to you, you did a great job with that. So maybe we could find a follow-up topic later on. We could build on this and maybe we could do some more with this in a future episode. That would be, I think that would be cool.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely
Yeah.
willing to.
Yeah.
All
Definitely.
right. So we're going to wrap this up. Does anybody have any final thoughts or questions? Otherwise, I think we're going to call it a wrap here. Phil, any closing thoughts?
No, I'm good.
All right. So all the stuff that Debbie was working on and then Jeremy, we'll have those examples in our GitHub repo. We'll make it all available. This will be available on our YouTube channel for anybody who wants to go back and view it in a little bit more detail and review tips a little bit further. We thank everybody for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this, and we're going to say good night.